I looked at this individual as one of the stalwarts in fighting for conservative values in Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to be able to help bring him to Wichita. Jim DeMint served in the United States House of Representatives for South Carolina's 4th Congressional District from 1999 to 2005, and then he was elected to the United States Senate in 2004 and served as one of the South Carolina senators until he resigned in 2012 to become the president of Heritage Foundation. With 18 years of political experience working both inside and outside of Congress, DeMint offers a wealth of wisdom and insight to the volunteer grassroots armies that are reaching out to every state legislature in the country. And he's also the star of a brand new Prager University video that was just put out literally 3 weeks ago that already has about 11 million views. So it's gone certified viral at this point on YouTube. And we'd like to play that kind of as an introduction, and then we'll have Jim come up after that point. So if you want to pay attention to the screen, I think we've got all the audio and visual up, but we'll find out here in just a second.
The federal government has become a lumbering giant. With each passing year, it gets bigger and scarier. In 1965, Washington was $761 billion big. In 2016, it was $3.5 trillion, 5 times the size. If the government spent only the money it collected in taxes, that would be one thing. But it always spends more, which is why we're $20 trillion in debt. That's 13 zeros. Count them, 13. But the crazy spending isn't even the worst of it. Washington is involved in every part of our lives. Think about anything you do, from driving your car to buying your groceries to mowing your lawn. Whatever it is, your education, your job, your health, the government has its hands on your shoulder, if not on your throat. As a congressman and senator for 14 years, I know this only too well. So how do we cut this giant down to size? Is it even possible? Yes. And the amazing thing is, the answer is right in front of us. The Founding Fathers, in their wisdom, foresaw the situation we find ourselves in today. They wrote into the Constitution a way to repair Washington, not from the inside, because that will never happen, but from the outside, where it might. It's right there in Article 5. Most people are familiar with the first part. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. All 27 amendments we have now started this way. Congress proposed them, and at least 3/4 of the states ratified them. But is this the only way to amend the Constitution? Well, let's read the next clause. It says that Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Did you catch that? Congress must call a convention to amend the Constitution if 2/3 of the states, that's 34 states, demand it. The time has come to demand it. The time has come to propose amendments that will restore meaningful limits on federal power and authority. The time has come for a convention of states. Here's how it would work. Once the 34 states call a convention, all 50 states send a delegate to represent their interest. For any constitutional amendments proposed, each state gets 1 vote. And an amendment only passes out of the convention and to the states for ratification if a majority of the state's delegates vote in the affirmative. In this scenario, Congress has no say. It is completely in the hands of the states, which means it's a whole lot closer to the hands of the people. We've never once amended the Constitution this way, but that doesn't mean we can't. But you might ask, doesn't this open the door to rewriting the entire Constitution? Antonin Scalia, the late Supreme Court Justice, acknowledged this risk, but regarded it as a minimal and reasonable one. Why? Because to be ratified, a proposed amendment would need the approval of 38 states. That's a high bar. 38 states would never agree to something radical like abolishing freedom of speech. The founders, Scalia said, knew the Congress would be unwilling to give attention to many issues the people are concerned with. particularly those involving restrictions on the federal government's own power. So they provided the Convention of States as a remedy. This should not be a partisan left-right, Democrat-Republican issue. This should be a who controls your life issue, you or the government. Today, politicians can turn your life upside down on a whim, kind of like King George in 1775. Being at the mercy of distant, disconnected rulers was why the American Revolution was fought in the first place. But we don't need a revolution. We have Article 5. So what amendments might a Convention of States propose to limit Washington's power? Term limits for one, and no one should be in Congress for 20 or 30 years. The only people who disagree have been in Congress for 20 or 30 years. And how about a limit on taxes, spending, and borrowing? Since you began this video, the national debt has gone up $8.4 million. Here's one more idea. A constitutional amendment that Congress can't exempt itself from the laws it passes. Something it's done dozens of times, from insider trading to Obamacare. Now, I don't believe a Convention of States will solve all of America's problems, but the founders put it in the Constitution for a reason. They knew a time would come when Washington would become so big and so intrusive that only we, the people, could cut it down to size. That time is now. I'm Jim DeMint for Prager University.
Thank you for watching this video. Please keep Prager video.
And I'd like to introduce former Senator Jim DeMint.
Thank you, David. David, I appreciate you and your whole team. Everybody who's here, a volunteer, Convention of States, just lift your hand up so folks can see them. Thank you. It inspires me, and I'm grateful to be here in Kansas. My dad was born and raised in Raymond, Kansas. Most of you probably don't know where that is, but I think it's about an hour down the road towards the west over there. So it's almost like I'm home. I appreciate all of you and the Republican Party leadership that are here from around the state. I also appreciate just this group coming together, creating a critical mass of citizenry to help create more accountable government. You know, Thomas Jefferson told us that the natural course of things is for government to advance and for liberty to recede. What that means, if we don't do anything as citizens, the government is going to continue to expand and to take our freedoms away. Government really is like gravity. It's constantly pulling for more power and more money. It happens at the local and state level, but it's a much bigger problem at the federal level. Because here in Kansas, if you make a decision that hurts people in Kansas, it doesn't hurt us in South Carolina. It doesn't hurt the other 49 states. And in fact, your citizens are going to keep looking across the border at other states doing it differently and doing it better. And eventually the political pressure will be for you to either copy that or do it better. But when we do something wrong in Washington, it hurts everybody. And it becomes almost impossible to change. I mean, we know that power corrupts. And that's why our founders were so insistent that power be divided, that we recognize the human tendency to create more power and to draw more power and money into government. We know absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's really what's happening in Washington right now. That's why we've got the corruption and all the problems. We should not be surprised. If we let the government basically get involved in all areas of our lives, you're going to see corruption and you're going to see problems and you're going to see that our country is not nearly as well off as it would be. You know, after serving 6 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate and 4 years in a prominent conservative think tank, I can tell you without any reservation, no exaggeration, Washington will never fix itself. No matter who we elect, no matter which party is in power, Congress will continue to deficit spend, regulations will continue to expand, Individual liberties will diminish. The power of states will continue to decline. Political and economic power and corruption will continue to amass in Washington, D.C., and the budget will never balance, not until there's a complete fiscal meltdown. You know, our founders envisioned this day, and that's why they gave the states the right, and let me emphasize, the responsibility to restrain the federal government and restore the original limits on the power of the federal government through the Article 5 process. Yet I'm here as a former congressman and senator and as one of the leaders of the conservative movement to share with you why what is going on here and in states all around America is much more important to the future of our country than anything happening in Washington, D.C. The pay, the prestige, and media coverage for congressmen and senators may be better than state legislators. I appreciate those who are here today. But the very survival of our nation is now in the hands of the collective states, not Washington politicians. Our federal government has put America on an unsustainable course. And no matter who we send to Congress or the White House, no matter which party is in control, it is no longer politically possible for the federal government to avoid an inevitable disastrous destination for our nation and our fellow citizens. Now, I don't make these statements lightly. As someone who has fought alongside conservative champions like Senator Tom Coburn for over 20 years, and he's working with us on this project, it's not easy to admit, after I gave up my business and spent all those years away from my family, it's not easy to admit that we've accomplished little more than to slow the growth of spending and debt and regulations and the infringement on the rights of the states and the American people. No one who has served in Congress, the White House, or the federal courts for the last several decades can honestly tell you that this country is better off now than when they began their service. This is not to say I'm giving up on electing and supporting conservatives in Congress. In fact, I've started a new organization to answer the question, what happens to good people once you send them to Washington? I mean, there is just no support on the inside for doing the right thing. And a lot of you probably feel the same way in the state legislature here. And so I'm going to continue to work on it. We can't ever give up on Washington because they can do so much damage so quickly. But it's well past time that all thinking Americans agree that Washington will never willingly give up its power. You know, the people who object to what we're doing here or say it's risky or something like that, I just want to remind them of several simple ideas. We're on an unsustainable course. We all know Washington's not going to fix it. So what is your solution? The Washington establishment, with its academic propaganda machine, its media allies, its lobbyists, its corporate cronies, its career politicians and bureaucrats, and its worldwide collection of special interests will never, and I repeat, never, willingly give their power back to the states and to the people. But we will continue to fight in Washington if for no other reason than to buy time for the states, for we the people, to take the action that our founders envisioned in the Constitution for such a time as this. Many of the biggest problems we face in America today were created by Washington, D.C. And yet so many Americans continue to look to Washington to make America great again. But I'm here to tell you that Washington cannot do it, and they will not do it. Our national government was never meant to be what it is today. It's treated almost like it were our God, and it behaves almost as if it is our God. But Washington isn't the master of the people. The people are the masters of the government. The federal government didn't create the states. The states created the federal government. Congress isn't our provider. It is we, the people, the work of our hands, the sweat of our brows, the industries that we create, the businesses that we run that provide the funding that Congress doles out. So who decides the direction of our nation and the policies that govern us? The people were meant to decide. Right now, Washington is deciding, and that won't change. You know, that, my friends, it's really an insult to our founders. It's a failure of we the people to achieve what George Washington referred to as the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. What all our founders talked about was vigilance. You have a republic if you can keep it. You can imagine if someone had told James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, or John Adams that the Congress they were creating would one day be deciding what kind of products can be bought and sold in the market, and that Congress would be able to order people to buy them. What would they have said if someone told them that the judicial branch, which they designed to be the least dangerous of the three branches, would one day be deciding policy for every state in the Union, every county, every town and neighborhood on fundamental issues such as education, marriage, abortion? Where does this kind of power come from? Where is it delegated to the national government in our Constitution? It's not. The founders were so careful to create checks and balances that would keep the national government in its place and to make it accountable to the people. I wonder what they would have said if someone had predicted that one day the American people would be subject to 178,000 pages of regulations issued by bureaucrats that were never elected by the people and had no accountability to them. All of this government overreach is bad enough even if it were accomplishing good things, because it defies the rule of law. But the reality is that these actions of our federal government are not only abuses of power and perversions of the Constitution, they're ruining our country and they're hurting our people. I could recite plenty of numbers to you to demonstrate how Washington is ruining our country financially. We know the $20 trillion figure in debt, but that's only a small part of it. Our country is probably close to 120 to 150 trillion in debt for unfunded liabilities from promises we've made for Social Security, for Medicare, for veterans benefits, for all the road money, the trust funds that have been emptied. There's no money in any trust fund in Washington. Let me assure you that. All of us, like I have been paying into Social Security and Medicare for 45 years, and they haven't saved one dime for me. So my children and grandchildren are going to have to pay the taxes to pay for my Social Security and Medicare. And the problem is there's a lot more of us over 65 than there are of them working now, and the cost is only going to get higher. The numbers are so huge now with debt, what our Federal Reserve has done to buy our debt, that it's almost become so big that we don't even pay attention to it anymore. We know the federal involvement with our schools have not given us better schools. We know the federal involvement with health care just in the last few years. Less choices, much higher cost, and it's just getting started. Our roads and bridges are crumbling, even though we're spending a lot more money because we're sending it through Washington, and it's coming back with so many regs and union rules and everything that a lot of that money never hits the pavement. And what is every bit as real, though less tangible, is the moral devastation Washington is wreaking on America. I say that because I believe it is morally devastating for any people to passively accept disabling dependency on government. Too much of what Washington is doing is not only disabling and degrading, but illegitimate according to the Constitution. It is morally devastating for people to look to the government to provide their basic human needs. But that's what so many Americans have come to expect, because that's what the federal government and the politicians have made us expect. Instead of seeing ourselves as people created by God and accountable to His law, as responsible for ourselves and for our government, today so many Americans see our government as responsible for them. You know, that is morally devastating to a people whose birthright is to live free and to govern themselves. We've become so accustomed to the intrusive presence of D.C. in every area of our lives that we've grown complacent about it. And many Americans today don't even know what it looks like to be the ones to decide where their kids go to school, who their doctors are, or even know what it would cost. So what are we going to do about this situation? Are we really going to keep doing the same thing and expect different results? You know, I've been working for years. I started Senate Conservatives Fund. I really did raise millions of dollars to help people like Mike Lee and Ted Cruz and Rand Paul and Pat Toomey and Paul Ryan, all who were opposed by the Republican Party in Washington in their primaries, to bring new people into Congress, believing that the problem in Washington is we didn't have enough good people. But that's not the problem. We could have 60 Republicans now in the Senate, and I can promise you we would not balance the budget. It's not going to happen. I'm here today to tell you that I'm a part of a resurgence of true patriotism that is sweeping the nation through the Convention of States project. You know, I go all around the country and people regularly come up to me. They'll grab my hand and they'll say, "Thanks for fighting. We're praying for you." And then they'll say, "What can I do?" And a lot of them have been working for years. They've worked with me and the Tea Party to try to really give Republicans the majority in the House, and they came back in 14 and gave the Senate Republicans majority in the Senate. They came back in 16 and elected Trump. And everyone's starting to question that sending good people to Washington or electing Republicans is not making any difference. They're looking for something they can do to help save the country. The 3 million plus volunteers that make up the grassroots army of Convention of States have pushed away this idol of big government and are hard at work to spread the word to their fellow citizens that there is a way, that the people can save this country. What they're saying is it wasn't meant to be this way. We were meant to be free. We were meant to decide. That, my friends, is the beauty of America. That's the experiment that George Washington referred to over 200 years ago when our nation was in its infancy. The experiment of America is a test of whether a free people can effectively govern themselves under a federal system, and whether through self-governance they will pursue virtue. Some conservatives today might be tempted to say that the experiment has been a failure, judging by the weight of our national government that presses down upon individuals and families and businesses, and judging by the extent to which so many have just given in and accepted it. But the majority of our states have decided to move in a more conservative direction. 33 are in the hands of House and Senate in Republican hands. People are sending a signal that they want a conservative type of government, more fiscally responsible, more morally empowering. So the experiment isn't over yet. It's only reached a new stage. We need to put it back in the right hands. We're at a stage where we find out if the people today have enough hunger for liberty to do the hard work of restoring it. It's a stage where we set in motion the one constitutional process the founders gave us that is capable of reinstating meaningful limitations on the power of D.C. There's just one. There's one peaceful constitutional way that we have left to save this country. I'm talking about the process in Article 5, the Convention of States process that requires you sitting in this room today to act. The state-led Article 5 convention is the most powerful of all the checks and balances the framers created in the Constitution, and we have never used it. I think they would be distraught if they knew that we hadn't done this 30 or 40 years ago. If we're serious about putting Washington back in its limited place and restoring the rule of law and self-governance, then we have to use this process. We need you sitting in this room today to pass a resolution in Kansas for an amendment proposing convention. This is not a constitutional convention. This is not a convention to rewrite the Constitution. This is a convention where states can propose amendments to restore the original limits and intent of the Constitution. Specifically, we need constitutional amendments on 3 topics: imposing real fiscal restraints on the federal government, such as balancing the budget and limiting taxes. The second is limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government over the states, such as unfunded mandate, or running our schools or our healthcare system, or control of our roads and bridges. The third is setting term limits on federal officials, including bureaucrats, judges, and congressmen and senators. Regardless of how you feel about term limits at state level, I can tell you that anybody who's still in Congress after 12 years, out of compassion, should be taken home. So I want to spend a few minutes today outlining the basic processes and then tell you the goals of the Convention of States project. For starters, we know the founders' whole purpose of including the convention mechanism was to provide a way for states to bypass Congress in achieving needed constitutional amendments. An early draft of Article 5 vested Congress with the sole power to propose constitutional amendments. Under that version, the states could ask Congress to propose, but Congress did the proposing. On September the 15th, 1787, towards the end of the Constitutional Convention, Colonel George Mason for Virginia strenuously objected to that first version of Article 5. He pointed out that this would provide no recourse for the states if the national government became overbearing, which he predicted it would. The result was a unanimous decision to adopt the current version of Article 5, providing 2 ways for the Constitution amendments to be proposed. Congress can propose them, or the states can come together and propose them. But either way, 38 states have to ratify them. So there's no more danger in the states proposing them than Congress proposing them. Folks, I've worked in Congress. I'm much more comfortable with states proposing amendments than Congress. If you want to lose your First Amendment or Second Amendment rights, just leave it the way it is. I guarantee you, they're going to continue to chip away, whether it's the courts or the Congress, they're going to continue to chip away at your rights. But 38 states, your rights are much more safe with 38 states. Thank you for that. Now, the reason the framers chose the interstate convention mechanism to bypass Congress was because they were so familiar with it. That was the way the states did business before the Constitution was written. The precedent and all the history of the interstate conventions fills in all the details that are not specified in Article 5 about how a convention would operate. It was just well known. It's in precedent. It's been held up by the courts for many years. You'll hear people say that because some of the details of how a convention would run are not specifically written in Article 5, that all we have is opinion about what would happen if we really had a convention. But that's not true at all. We have history to guide us, the same history that originalists for the Constitution used to interpret and apply every area of the Constitution now. We know from history that voting at an Article 5 convention would be done on a one-state, one-vote basis. This is a universal precedent set by 32 interstate conventions that occurred prior to the convention's drafting. There's no other way it would go any other way. This explains why they thought it unnecessary for Article 5 to specify the number of delegates that could be sent to a convention, because the states could send as many delegates as they wanted, but they still just get one vote. We know that state legislatures choose and instruct their delegates to the convention, and that the delegates are agents of the state legislatures. Again, this is a matter of universal historical precedent for interstate conventions. We also know that the topic specified in the convention application does matter. Over 400 applications for an Article 5 convention have been filed since the drafting of the Constitution. The reason we've never had one is because there have never been 34 applications seeking a convention for the same purpose. The state applications contain the agenda for the Article 5 convention, and until 34 states agree on a convention agenda in advance, there'll be no convention. Because the authority of an Article 5 convention is derived from the 34 state applications that trigger it, the topic for amendments specified in those applications are a binding limitation on the scope of the convention. Folks, there can be no runaway convention. There can be a runaway Congress, runaway courts, runaway bureaucrats, but there cannot be a runaway Article 5 convention. Amendment proposals that garner the support of the majority of states at the convention are then submitted to the states for ratification. And again, it takes 3/4 of the states or 38 states to ratify. So if we're serious about putting Washington back in its limited place and restoring the rule of law and self-governance, then we have to use this process. We need the state legislatures to pass resolutions for an amendment proposing convention under Article 5 that limit federal debt, jurisdiction, and the terms of federal officials. We've got to address all three of these areas in an actual convention where they meet, where delegations from all 50 states sit down to discuss, deliberate, draft, debate, edit, and eventually vote on specific proposals. And those proposals go back to the states for ratification. This is an arduous process, and that's why I say we need to address all three subject matters at the convention. A balanced budget is a good idea, but it's not enough. If you don't limit the taxes, if you don't make them follow general accounting principles, they'll just get around a balanced budget. Term limits are a good idea, but not enough by themselves. We have to restore constitutional limitations on federal power. We have to get D.C. out of the policy-making areas that were always intended for the states. You know, I have to laugh, and I try to do it respectfully, but now that I've studied this issue for a long time, when people say that states proposing amendments is risky and that we could have a runaway convention that would end up with crazy amendments that would take away our rights. You know, we all know, as I mentioned, that we have a runaway federal government. We've had a runaway convention when none of us were just invited to it. Our Constitution is no longer the little pocket thing we carry around and love. It is now, and this is actually what is used in Washington by the courts, by Congress. It's a 2,800-page, 2,800 pages of annotated Constitution. This case law that has gradually usurped all the limits on federal power. There's no such thing as a 10th Amendment anymore that says the federal government is limited to specific things listed in the Constitution, and the rest, the states and the people. They don't follow that. I can tell you folks, the only time I heard about the Constitution when I was in the Congress was when I took my oath of office. And that's the last time it came up. The only way we're going to get power back is for states to deal with this. I'm not a bit concerned about a state convention, but I'm very concerned about leaving things the way they are. And so those who have problems with this, I would just encourage you to study this and follow it. The logic of states sending delegates to do a specific thing and then states approving something different, it just is not going to happen. So please think through this, because it is the only way we have now to save our country. That's why I'm way out here in Wichita, Kansas right now, instead of home in Greenville, South Carolina, or in Washington working there, because I know they can't fix it. You know, if you think that something could come out of this convention that would be crazy, remember that all you need is one of the houses in 13 states to stop any amendment. And folks, if you don't think there are 13 states that would stop anything related to Second Amendment, losing Second Amendment power, you hadn't counted the states like I have. We're in safe hands when states come together and propose things that limit the federal government. Folks, my fellow Americans, the Article 5 Convention of the States is the only solution as big as our nation's problems. And I'm convinced that the states and we the people are ready for the challenge. 12 states have already passed the Convention of States resolution as we have written it, and to incorporate our 3 topics. We really need Kansas to act. It's hard here because a supermajority is required, but you have a supermajority of Republicans in both houses. And Republicans, by nature, should believe in this idea of federalism, in states making more of their own decisions. And it's hard for me to believe that someone who calls themselves a Republican would not believe that the states could come together and propose clarifying amendments that restore the limits on the Constitution. I believe the American people will not rest until we get 34 states and have a convention. You know, it really encourages me to see just a 5-minute video that's just online within 3 weeks. The title is How the States Can Save America. You've got nearly 11 million people. 60% of them that watch that are millennials. And 94% of the people who saw that video said they support the Convention of the States. This is an easy sell. People are not going to trust Congress to control their lives. Their approval rating is getting down close to the negative area now. And while state legislatures have their own issues, I know that. Believe me, I've been in Washington and I've worked with lots of state legislatures. I'm much more comfortable with the states charting our course now. I believe we'll succeed in shifting power away from D.C. back to the states and local levels so that we once again have a nation where people decide which policies will govern them. Some states will choose a liberal progressive path, socialized medicine, government-run schools. Some will choose a more conservative path with more choices in education, more choices in health care. But the point is not what we decide, but where it's decided, and that the people in those states can make that decision. And if you don't like the decisions that are made here in Kansas, there's always a place for you in South Carolina. The ultimate hope of the founders was in the almighty hand of providence. But to that hope, they joined their courage and their tireless labors to create a nation where self-government would be possible. I know without a doubt that many of you in this room still place your hope in the almighty hand of providence. And we know that unless God builds a house, it's not going to get built. But the question that now remains is whether enough of you will demonstrate the courage of our founders by making your stand through the power the Constitution gives you to restore meaningful liberty and self-governance in America. Yet I didn't come here today presuming to tell you what's best for Kansas. But I came here today as someone who has worked in Washington tirelessly, probably as hard as anyone who's been there in the last couple of decades, to stop the spending, the earmarks, and the debt. And I'm here to tell you and to plead with you to help us save our country and to humbly suggest that the destiny of this last great hope of mankind is in your hands. So may God bless you, bless Kansas, and our republic. Thanks for the chance to speak today. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Yeah, I'll certainly take some questions, and we've got a guy with a microphone here.
Thanks for joining us today and bringing us that illumination of this process. Two things I've heard and thought about is when you said today term limits aren't enough. So I mean, I think that you said term limits aren't enough. And the other thing that I've heard concerns me is just like in Washington, you get all those people together and each one says, well, if you'll endorse my program, I'll endorse your program. I wonder if that isn't possible at Convention of States. So we might get some things that on the East Coast are okay, but wouldn't be okay in the Midwest. I just wonder if you would address those.
Yeah. Well, I'm convinced that the states have a lot more in common than they don't. And since I know that there's states west of here that like this idea because the federal government controls so much of their land. They can't develop energy. They can't use it recreationally. They can't take care of their forests. And so they really like the second subject matter of limiting the power and scope of the federal government. Probably the least favorite part of this, the state legislators don't generally like the term limits, because a lot of them, I think, someday would like to run for Congress and go up there. But again, as an act of mercy, if you let them go and stay more than 12 years, it's just, it's a cruel and unusual thing to do to anyone. And then after you get there, you don't know any better. You think you're all right. The swamp becomes a hot tub. It feels good. But I've gotten off some, but anyway, I believe in, when I went, one of the things that helped me most in Congress is when I went to the House, I said, I will not serve more than 6 years. Either I run for something else or go home. That helped me not to worry what they did to me. If they didn't want me to have a committee because I was fighting against some kind of spending, I figured I could deal with that for a few years. And the same when I went to the Senate. But I do know that term limits alone are not going to fix the problem. The jurisdictional issue is probably the most important, because we can't balance the budget if the federal government keeps trying to run every area of our lives. I mean, they're spending all this money on education, on health care, welfare, all this housing, food stamps, everything. They're not taking care of the things it says they should do. I mean, two things: they got to defend our nation. And we're now in a very bad spot, and the world's a lot more dangerous than it was. And they're not protecting our borders or dealing with our immigration issue. The things they're supposed to do that create a law and order framework for us to live in freedom, they're not doing, and they don't have the money to do it because they're spending money on things they don't know how to do and can't do from the federal level. So, there's a movement that wants an Article 5 convention just to balance the budget. And I appreciate what they're doing, but I've been in Washington, and they would tell you they balance the budget every year now. Just like a business balances its budget by borrowing an extra $1 million, the budget's balanced, but they owe $1 million. And we do that every year, except we're not talking millions, we're talking trillions now. So this package of 3 subject areas, I'm comfortable that they're not going to get outside those parameters without the chairman gaveling it out of order. If they do pass a crazy amendment, it's likely to be struck down by the courts because it's outside the Article 5 framework, and 38 states will never ratify it. So the safeties here are just very reassuring to me. So, okay, yes, sir.
Yes, Sean Hannity talks about the penny plan to cut federal spending. Are you familiar with the penny plan that he proposes?
Yeah,
And could you explain how that works?
Well, it's just basically you cut a penny every year out of every government program, or kind of 1%, I think is what they're talking about, and it's over time. You just see the growth of the federal government slows down and the economy continues to grow, and you can get to a balanced budget. And we've proposed that before. You'd think that would be simple, but the whole the left now is funded by government growth. When I first got to Congress, there were still Democrats, we called them blue dogs, that would support fiscal responsibility. And there are some Democrats now that are talking about fiscal responsibilities because they don't want tax cuts. And they're suddenly afraid of deficits, and they've never been afraid of them before. But again, I guess I've just said it too many times. They're just not capable anymore of cutting spending and being fiscally responsible, because all the pressure inside Washington is for more spending. And since the constituency for the left all depends on government growth, government employees join unions, unions pay dues to Democrats, and it's just a continuous cycle. So right now the Republicans are saying, please give us a little money to rebuild our military, and Chuck Schumer is saying, dollar for dollar. Any dollar you get from military, we get another dollar for domestic spending. No one's talking about the debt. Yes, sir.
Senator, thank you for being here for the Convention of the States People to bring you here. My name is Representative Chuck Weber. I slept in ahead of the introductions earlier, but I've served on the Federal and State Committee where we have this vote. We had a vote last session. I just want to give a really brief update. Tom Colburn came and gave a great presentation. My colleague, Representative Humphreys, we thought we had the votes to move it out of committee. There were 2 conservatives on the committee that voted no, and it's a confusion issue.
Yeah.
I think and listen, bad on me, because you never assume a vote,
Yeah.
right? And so I just wanted to say that we have the momentum, I think, to get that back on track in Topeka, at least on the House side. I know that you guys did great work this summer in Denver with the speaker and getting him back on board. I don't want to speak for you, but I mean, I think he's got, and also the president of the Senate as well. So I think there's some momentum there, but this confusion, I just wonder if you could just speak.
Yeah, I will, and
That's
it's hard,
my
and
colleagues.
I respect those who say, no, this is risky, because if you'd asked me 5 years ago before I really looked into it, I would have said, no, this is dangerous. And frankly, I'd read the Constitution a lot. I never really noticed this in Article 5 until Mark Levin started talking about it and write about it. Tom Coburn wrote a great book about all the details. And, Phyllis Schlafly was a great friend of mine, but she had become convinced after Roe v. Wade many, many years ago, and one of the justices that voted for Roe v. Wade told her, no, you don't want a convention to get rid of Roe v. Wade. It could get out of control. And that was her opinion. And again, I understand, I'm just pleading with conservatives to think through this. I've heard people say, oh, that first Constitutional Convention was a runaway. Why did 13 states who sent delegates ratify it if they didn't like what they came up with? I mean, none of this makes sense. And so like you said, it is misinformation. The most dangerous thing that could happen now is to do nothing. The only constitutional route to rein in the federal government, unless someone else has another solution I don't know about. It was fun to be in Ohio a couple of months ago. They have a new federalism committee to try to wrestle back money and power from the federal government. And there's a person from the Eagle Forum was in front of me, and he really gave my speech for me. He went through all the problems with the federal government, everything they were doing, how bad things were, and Washington said, but this Article 5 thing is risky. And so the chairman looked at him, and he went back through all the statistics of the debt and all the bad things that were happening, and he said, if now's not the time to do it, when is it? And then the guy didn't say anything, and he said, well, what is your solution? He didn't have any answers. And someone can say, well, we can keep electing good people, we got to get Washington to do this, and we need a different president. That's been my mindset for 20 years. Just work as hard as you can in Washington, get people there, try as hard as you can. But, insanity is continuing to do the same thing and expect different results. And I'm here to tell you, I just couldn't be clearer, I don't think, is Washington will not do it. We're going to keep spending till we bankrupt the country. I don't know if that's going to be next week, next year, 3 years from now, but with a Republican majority in both houses and a Republican president, there is no talk of ever balancing the budget. So we need Kansas, and I'm encouraged that you're this close and that your leadership in the House and the Senate is going to do this. But I would just encourage all the Republicans and conservatives, if you think through this, you'll realize, first of all, we don't have anything to lose. If we don't do anything, it's just going to get worse. If you told me there was a 90% chance this convention would be a disaster, but a 10% chance it could work, I'd say that's better odds than not doing anything. But I'm telling you here, I'm 100% satisfied that there's absolutely no risk to doing this. We might have a convention and not get any amendments that are ratified. The chances are nothing will happen. But I'm hoping that people every day are going to see from what happens in Washington. Every day Washington's given us another reason to do this. That's why I believe it's going to get done in the next couple of years.
First, thank you for coming. And question, you alluded to millennials. what can we do and more can you do through your entity to get millennials involved? I have two sons that are like 28, 29, and they ignore both parties as a group.
That sounds pretty smart to me.
But many times, some of their friends think Bernie Sanders is the answer. And
That doesn't sound smart at all. Well, I tell you, it's,
my question is, what can we as individuals do as well as yourself? You mentioned your video.
Yeah.
To attract them because they're sitting there, I think, as a group to be swayed one way or the other.
Yeah, well, I can tell you this makes more sense to them than just about anything else. They don't trust Washington. A lot of them have gotten off the liberal path. A lot of them have kind of becoming libertarians. But if 60% of, that means over 6 or 7 million millennials have watched this, and just about all of them have become supporters. And Charlie Kirk with Turning Point, I don't know if you know about that organization, the young guy who's leading the movement on college campuses all across the country. He's endorsed this idea and is working on it with us. I think this is going to be a millennial issue. So the way we can help with that is just not mess it up. And so this could be a way young people could get engaged in the right way to look at government. The federalism approach, that we have a republic, not a democracy, we have a republic. And for states to be leading the way is something I want millennials to see, instead of looking to Washington as an almighty power. It's really dangerous when you have that much power in a central authority. So this is an opportunity to show Americans, particularly younger people, how this country can work much better and how they can be involved and make a difference. So I think we have time for one more. Okay.
Senator DeMint, thank you so much for coming to Wichita, and you made your home state proud. You've been great in Congress over the years. Couldn't be more proud of you. If you look at a map of the United States, you'll notice that Kansas is kind of in the middle there. And I don't know where this convention would physically be. Has that already been decided?
There what?
Has it already been decided where the convention would be, where it would take place?
No, actually the first meeting, Congress, once 34 states make application, Congress will designate a time and place for the meeting. But all it is going to, I suspect what will happen is they will meet somewhere and decide they're going to have 4 or 5 meetings, and where it's going to be. One might be in Wichita, one might be in LA, but I doubt if they'll do all this on a weekend. But the only role that Congress has is they are required to call the convention, and then after that, the convention itself can decide where the next meeting is and who the chairman is. So, if you're lobbying for doing it in Wichita,
of course I am. But here's my real question: in the Obamacare debacle, we have a Supreme Court that said that they can force me to take money out of my pocket and spend it on something I don't want to spend it on. I think if we have a convention of the states, that's the most important thing to correct right now.
Yeah. And
yet I don't think under the 3 umbrella plan that you have that can be decided. So
certainly it can under the second limit the authority and jurisdiction, specifically that, and basically this whole healthcare thing comes in just a complete perversion of the Commerce Clause.
All right. Okay. So if that can be covered, I'm on board.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I guess we've run out of time, folks. I appreciate your vigilance. Thank you.